to these wonderful arrangements of spirituals. And the spirituals were really just the songs that the slaves out in the fields would sing. And there was no harmonies written down at first. It was an oral sort of a tradition. And it's interesting because spirituals, even though there was slavery in other parts of the world, spirituals are distinctly American. And partly it was because many of them were forced to go into the Christian churches, and there was that hymnal tradition, and there was some connection to that. But as one writer said, the slaves were deprived of their languages, their families, and their cultures, but the masters could never take away their music. And it really became a way to express the oppression, the struggle, but also there was always a hope. There was a hope that something better was around there. And on much of the spirituals, even at their saddest, there is that hope. And I'm going to read some quotes about it that explains it. The other idea is that many times these spirituals were actually coded language, especially during the Underground Railroad, for the slaves to try to escape. Things like wade in the water or steal away. If they were singing these, it was time to get in the water, go in the deep river. So some of this is really fascinating on the language. There's been some really great studies. There are probably over 6,000 spirituals. And once slavery was abolished, there was some fear that the spirituals would go away. It was an oral tradition. People started to go around trying to write them down as early as 1868. But what really helped was that in Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, starts up in early 1870s, an all African-American university. And there were a group of singers there who got together called the Fisk Jubilee Singers. They started to sing these spirituals and make arrangements of them for larger and larger groups. And then they toured all across the United States, bringing this music sometimes for the first time to people, and then ultimately over to England. And we're going to see the last person we're going to play on this program, last in this half, is a British composer who had not heard of spirituals until the Fisk Jubilee Singers came to London in the 1890s, and it really opened his eyes. There's a wonderful quote from Hall Johnson, who is one of the great arrangers of spirituals from the early 1920s, and he said this about the spirituals. True enough, this music was transmitted to us through humble channels, but its source is that of all great art everywhere, the unquenchable, divinely human longing for a perfect realization of life. It traverses every shade of emotion without spilling over in any direction. Its most tragic utterances are without pessimism, and its lightest, brightest moments have nothing to do with frivolity. In its darkest expressions, there is always a hope, and in its gayest measures, a constant reminder of suffering. Born out of the heart cries of a captive people who still did not forget how to laugh, this music covers an amazing range of mood. Nevertheless, it is always serious music and should be performed seriously in the spirit of its original conception. Now, one of the first of the great composers who recognized the power of these spirituals and the beauty of them was the Czech composer Anton Dvorak. He had been over in the Czechoslovakia discovering the folk music of that area. And in 1892, he was actually invited to New York to become the first president of the National Conservatory of Music. That was our first conservatory of music in the United States, sort of near where Juilliard is now. And he was the head of that for a few years. And while he was here, he traveled around the United States. He went out west, spent some time in Iowa, where there was a big Czech population. South Dakota, he heard a lot of the Native American tunes out there and thought they were just so beautiful. He went down in Appalachia and heard some of the Appalachian folk songs. But he also traveled in the South and began to hear the spirituals. And he recognized that this was the music that could put America on the map. Up to this point, American composers were trying to emulate the European composers and write kind of European music. But he encouraged all the students at the conservatory to listen to the American music. And here's what he said. The inspiration for a truly national American music must be derived from the Negro melodies. I was led to take this view by the fact that the so-called plantation songs are indeed the most striking and appealing melodies that have yet been found on this side of the water. The most potent and the most beautiful among them, the spirituals, all of which are distinguished by unusual and subtle harmonies, the likes of which I have found in no other songs but those of old Scotland and Ireland. And one last quote I wanted to read, which is such a powerful quote from W.E.B. Du Bois in his Souls of Black Folk, an incredible book written in 1903. And again, he talks about how this music is the American music. He said, "Little of beauty has America given the world, save the rude grandeur that God himself stamped on her bosom. The human spirit in this new world has expressed itself in vigor and ingenuity rather than in beauty. And so by fateful chance, the Negro folk song, the rhythmic cry of the slave, stands today not simply as the sole American music, but as the most beautiful expression of human experience born on this side of the seas. It has been neglected, is half despised, and above all, persistently mistaken and misunderstood. But notwithstanding, it still remains as the singular spiritual heritage of the nation and the greatest gift of the Negro people. Through all the sorrow of the spirituals, there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things. The minor cadences of despair change often to triumph and calm confidence. Sometimes it is faith in life, sometimes faith in death. Sometimes assurance of boundless justice in some fair world beyond. But whichever it is, the meaning is always clear, that sometimes, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not by their skins. Is such a hope justified? So even 120 years later, we're still going through this, and it really makes these songs incredibly powerful. So we're going to hear first a woman named Undine Smith Moore, who unfortunately is not so well known. She was born in 1904 in Virginia, was the granddaughter of slaves, of course. She attended Fisk University and then got the first scholarship from there to Juilliard School of Music in the early 1930s. So she gets a degree there, gets a degree at Columbia as well, a master's degree, ends up teaching at Virginia State College, and is the founder of the Black Music Center there, where a number of composers come together and start to get their music and discover other composers, black composers. She wrote lots of pieces and was actually nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for her Scenes from a Life of a Martyr. That's an oratorio on the life of Dr. Martin Luther King that she wrote right after he was assassinated, and you can hear that. It's a really powerful piece. She once said, "Art preserves life in a very special way. Our memories might die with us, but art preserves our values and our experiences." So what you're going to hear now are four different movements, four different spirituals that she takes and makes some interesting arrangements of them for piano trio. Now the first one is a combination of "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen" and "Brothers, Will You Pray for Me." Starts off with this very beautiful, slow and quiet cello solo, builds to a climax with some rather dissonant, harsh-sounding chords, which to me sort of express the suffering and the oppression in there, and then we finish up with the cello solo again. There's a really fun, fast one, "I Heard the Preaching of the Elder," and then a beautiful third one, "Who Is That Yonder? Oh, It Looks Like My Lord Coming in a Cloud." Just a very still, gorgeous spiritual. And then the last one is an all-out rebel rouser, "Shout All Over God's Heaven." So please enjoy Undine Smith Moore.